In the silent twilight of Istanbul, as the lights of rare hearths extinguished one by one, giving way to a flickering shadow stretching from the shores of the Bosphorus to the peaks of the Castle of Seven Towers, a figure glided through the cobbled streets. Enveloped in a cloak, unrecognizable, it was itself a merciless shadow, the embodiment of an all-seeing eye and a punishing hand. This was Murad IV, the 16th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, a man whose name entered history not only as that of a brave commander and reformer, but also as that of the Sultan-Executioner. He was destined to become the architect of a revival built on a foundation of fear and strewn with the heads of those who dared defy his will. In an era when the empire seemed inexorably heading towards decline, this young ruler, who ascended the throne at a tender age, decided that only blood could halt the decay, and only absolute, merciless power would restore greatness to his people and his state. The early 17th century found the Ottoman Empire in a state of deep crisis. The golden age of Suleiman the Magnificent had long passed, giving way to an era marked by power struggles, palace intrigues, and growing anarchy. Sultans succeeded one another with alarming rapidity, often proving to be either weak-willed, incompetent, or even mentally ill, like the unfortunate Mustafa I. Their rule became merely a facade for the true power, concentrated in the hands of powerful grand viziers, ambitious harem favorites, and, most dangerously, the excessively expanded and uncontrollable Janissary corps. These elite troops, once the pride of the sultans, had now turned into a predatory force, capable of overthrowing any ruler who dared infringe upon their privileges. They were not only soldiers, but also shopkeepers, artisans, moneylenders, and their interests often diverged from those of the state. Corruption, bribery, and open disobedience flourished everywhere. The treasury emptied, provinces rebelled, and external enemies, the Safavids in the east, the Habsburgs in the west, the Cossacks in the north, relentlessly tested the strength of the once unassailable empire. It was during this challenging period, presaging collapse, that Murad IV appeared on the historical stage. Born in 1612, in the last year of his father, Sultan Ahmed I's reign, Murad was destined from an early age to taste the bitterness of palace intrigues and the deadly struggle for the throne. His mother, Kösem Sultan, one of the most influential and ambitious women in Ottoman history, already held the reins of power firmly. Murad's childhood was spent in the shadow of her might and amidst constant fears for his own life and the fate of his brothers. He witnessed the madness of his uncle Mustafa I, who ascended the throne twice and was twice deposed due to his obvious insanity. He saw his elder brother, Sultan Osman II, who dared to challenge the Janissaries, overthrown and brutally murdered. These events, full of blood and betrayal, were forever imprinted on the young prince's memory. The kafes system, the cage, where princes were kept in isolation to prevent their involvement in conspiracies, condemned heirs to a life devoid of administrative and military experience, often leading to their mental decline. However, Murad, despite all these circumstances, proved to be a strong and observant individual. He silently studied the chaos around him, absorbed the lessons of others' mistakes, and perhaps even then harbored plans for restoring former greatness, even if it meant stepping over corpses. In 1623, when Murad was just 11 years old, he was elevated to the throne. His ascension was rather nominal. Real power remained in the hands of his mother Kösem Sultan, who ruled as regent, and the powerful Grand Vizier Kenamankush Kara Ali Pasha, as well as the Janissary commanders. These years of regency became a school of survival and observation for the young sultan. He saw how his mother, however intelligent and far-sighted she might have been, could not fully rein in the appetites of the palace clique and the military class. He observed how the Janissaries, accustomed to impunity, openly dictated their will, overthrew and appointed viziers, appropriated wealth, and even interfered with justice. Kösem's years of regency were marked by internal instability. Revolts in the provinces, especially in Anatolia, where Abaza Pasha and Emir Ganolu raised uprisings. Border conflicts with Persia, resulting in the Ottomans losing Baghdad. Cossack attacks on the Black Sea coast and even on the Bosphorus itself. The empire seemed to be slowly but surely falling apart. The young sultan, possessing an outstanding physique and physical strength that became legendary, gradually accumulated his inner fury. He saw his once formidable empire bleeding from 1,000 wounds inflicted from within. He silently watched as his predecessors either drifted helplessly or tried to fight and were brutally overthrown. A conviction ripened in his soul. Only ruthless firmness, even cruelty, could restore the state's former dignity. Every rebellion, every assassination of a vizier, every bribe, every act of disobedience were drops overflowing the cup of his patience. He waited for his hour, biding his time until he could fully assert his will. This moment arrived in 1632, when Murad turned 20 years old. The event that overflowed the cup of patience was an open rebellion of the Janissaries and Sipahis, who, driven by a thirst for power and wealth, demanded the execution of officials they disliked, and even of Grand Vizier Hafiz Ahmed Pasha. The Sultan, albeit reluctantly, acceded to their demand, and Hafiz Ahmed Pasha was brutally murdered right in the palace, before Murad's very eyes. This was an unthinkable humiliation for the Sultan, a demonstration of his complete powerlessness. But it was this act of violence that became the catalyst. That night, Murad swore that such disgrace would never again befall the Ottoman throne. He uttered the famous words, "Henceforth, I shall be a padishah who rules himself, and no one else will be allowed to interfere in my affairs." The next few years became a period of ruthless consolidation of power. Murad IV began his Great Purge. He systematically eliminated everyone who posed a threat to his power, regardless of their position or influence. Tens of thousands of people were executed on his command. He spared neither Janissary Agas nor Sipahi leaders, nor corrupt officials, nor even members of his own family. Grand Vizier Topal Recep Pasha, who had been appointed at the rebels' demand, was one of the first to feel the Sultan's iron will. Others followed. Many of the Janissary commanders who had previously dictated their will were executed. Murad personally oversaw the executions, sometimes even participating in them. He acted swiftly and decisively, giving conspirators no time to unite or resist. His methods were inhumane, but effective. For the first time in many decades, the Sultan's word became law, and his will a force before which even the most powerful trembled. This cruelty was not merely a manifestation of sadism, though some historians attribute to him a propensity for rage. It was a cold-blooded, calculated strategy. Murad understood that absolute centralized power was necessary to save the empire from complete collapse, and he was willing to pay any price, including rivers of blood, to restore it. He saw how anarchy was corroding the state, how internal weakness made it vulnerable to external enemies. For him, every rebel killed, every corrupt official executed, was a step toward the empire's revival. His actions, though horrifying, had a clear objective: to restore order, discipline, and the former greatness of the Ottoman state. He was convinced that only a firm hand could prevent the crumbling empire from falling into the abyss. Against the backdrop of this unprecedented power struggle, Murad IV issued a series of infamous decrees that forever linked his name with the image of the Sultan-Executioner. Under penalty of death, coffee, tobacco, and alcohol were forbidden. These prohibitions, which seem absurd to a modern person, were for Murad a logical continuation of his strategy to restore order and morality in society. Coffee, which appeared in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, quickly gained popularity and became an integral part of social life. Coffee houses, kahvehane, became centers of social activity where people gathered to socialize, exchange news, play board games, and discuss politics. It was in this that Murad saw a threat. Coffee houses, along with taverns, were perceived as hotbeds of idleness, gossip, and most dangerously, subversive activities. In these establishments where a diverse public gathered, conspiracies could be born, rumors undermining the authority of the government could spread. The Sultan, striving for total control, could not permit the existence of such independent centers of communication. Coffee houses became a symbol of uncontrolled social space where oppositional sentiments could form. Tobacco, brought to the empire by Europeans, also quickly spread among all segments of the population. Initially, many Islamic theologians debated its permissibility from a Sharia perspective, but generally it was not considered forbidden. However, for Murad, tobacco became not only a symbol of foreign influence and moral decay, but also a concrete danger. Historical chronicles, in particular, mention a devastating fire in Istanbul in 1633, which destroyed a large part of the city. The cause of the fire, according to many, was careless tobacco smoking. Murad, seeing the devastating consequences of the calamity and associating it with this new habit, took decisive measures. Tobacco smoking was equated with arson and became punishable by death. This was not merely a decree, but an act of retribution and an attempt to prevent future disasters. Alcohol, the consumption of which is unequivocally condemned in Islam, was forbidden by Murad with particular strictness. Although its consumption had never been completely eradicated in the empire, Murad decided to put an end to it once and for all. For him, drunkenness was a symbol of moral decay, a cause of disorder, crime, and the weakening of discipline, especially among the military. He himself, according to some accounts, was not averse to alcoholic beverages in his youth, but having established his power, he took a strict vow of sobriety and demanded the same from his subjects. His own example, it is said, was intended to inspire piety, but reality dictated harsh, punitive measures. Each of these prohibitions was not merely a moral or religious injunction. These were political acts aimed at total control over society, at eradicating everything that could distract citizens from their duties, weaken their will, or incite disobedience. Murad IV's decrees were absolute and uncompromising. Immediate death awaited the transgressor. And to ensure compliance with his laws, the Sultan developed a unique and terrifying method of control. At night, when the city fell still, plunging into darkness and silence, Murad IV would don simple clothes, disguising his sultanic bearing, and along with a few trusted confidants, among whom was the famous traveler Evliya Çelebi, he would embark incognito on night patrols through the streets of Istanbul. These patrols were not merely inspections, they were hunts. The Sultan aimed to personally catch transgressors of his decrees, to demonstrate the absolute inevitability of punishment. He wandered through the darkest alleyways, listening to rustles, searching for the slightest signs of violation. Legends and real accounts of these night raids are numerous and often gruesome. It is said that he could wander the city for hours, searching for those who dared to smoke tobacco in a hidden corner, or secretly drink a cup of coffee, or even worse, indulge in drunkenness. If he found someone violating his prohibitions, punishment followed immediately. The Sultan wasted no time on interrogations or trials. He was both judge and executioner. The sword he always carried with him immediately descended upon the neck of the unfortunate. The transgressor's head was severed right on the spot, often by the Sultan himself, and the body was left in the street as a warning to others. One of the most famous accounts, cited by Evliya Çelebi, describes how Murad IV discovered a man smoking tobacco in a coffee house. The Sultan, concealed beneath his cloak, approached him and asked, "What are you smoking, traveler?" The man, unaware of who stood before him, replied, "Tobacco, sir. What else?" Without a moment's hesitation, Murad drew his sword and with a single blow decapitated him. Such stories spread through Istanbul like wildfire, generating immense fear. The city fell silent at night. No one dared violate the Sultan's laws, knowing that around the corner the Padishah himself might be lurking, ready to unleash his merciless punishment upon them. Some historians have tried to explain these actions not only by a desire for order, but also by a psychological aspect. The internal tension that the Sultan experienced, battling anarchy and observing the empire's decline, could have been released through these acts of personal, immediate retribution. It was not only a way to assert power, but also, perhaps, a kind of outlet for his own rage and frustration. For Murad IV, who grew up in an atmosphere of constant threat, where death was part of daily life, taking a life became a tool of governance, a means of maintaining order which he considered the only possible way to save the empire. The consequences of these night patrols and brutal executions were profound. On the one hand, they generated unprecedented fear. The streets of Istanbul emptied at night, coffee houses closed or transformed into quiet tea houses, smoking and alcohol consumption went deep underground, order and discipline, albeit at the cost of terror, were restored. The janissaries and sipahis, who had previously dictated their will, now trembled before the Sultan, who did not hesitate to execute them for the slightest disobedience. His methods were inhumane, but they worked. They saved the empire from internal enemies who had almost brought it to its knees. On the other hand, these actions gave rise to a grim legend of Murad IV as the Sultan-Executioner, a bloodthirsty tyrant who reveled in execution. This reputation likely unfairly overshadowed his other achievements. Murad was not merely an executioner. He was a statesman who understood the need for radical reforms. He restored the empire's financial stability, fought corruption in the army and bureaucracy. But perhaps his most significant achievement was the military campaign against Safavid Persia. The culmination of his foreign policy was the famous campaign of 1638, when Murad IV personally led his army on a march to Baghdad. This city, once captured by the Persians, was a strategically important point and a symbol of imperial might. The Sultan demonstrated not only strategic thinking, but also personal bravery, participating in the siege and battles alongside his soldiers. The campaign to Baghdad was not just a military operation, it was a symbol of the revival of Ottoman military power. After several weeks of fierce fighting, Baghdad was taken. It was a grandiose victory that significantly raised the prestige of the Ottoman Empire on the international stage and restored its control over eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia. The capture of Baghdad marked the apex of his reign, demonstrating to the world that the Ottoman Empire, despite all its internal problems, still remained a formidable force. Upon returning from the campaign, Murad IV continued his reforms. He sought to restore old discipline in the army, especially among the janissaries, and to eradicate bribery and nepotism in the state apparatus. He also patronized construction and the arts, despite his severe reputation. New mosques, fountains, and palace structures were erected in Istanbul. He was a complex, multifaceted personality, a brilliant strategist and brave warrior, yet at the same time a ruthless tyrant. However, Murad IV's personal qualities were no less paradoxical than his reign. Despite his public sobriety and piety, according to some accounts, in the last years of his life, he himself indulged in excessive alcohol consumption, which possibly caused his premature death. This irony of fate, A sultan who executed thousands for wine, tobacco, and coffee, perhaps himself falling victim to his own prohibition, adds a tragic dimension to his image. Murad IV died in 1640 at the age of 27, presumably from liver cirrhosis. His death was unexpected and left the empire without a strong ruler. Before his death, in a fit of paranoia or for reasons still unclear, he ordered the execution of his last surviving brother, Ibrahim, who was ultimately saved only through the intervention of Qasem Sultan. Ibrahim, who had spent most of his life in the cafés, in isolation and fear, proved to be mentally unstable and earned the nickname the Mad. His reign once again plunged the empire into chaos. Thus, the Sultan-Executioner, Murad IV, left behind a dual legacy. On the one hand, he was the one who snatched the Ottoman Empire from the clutches of anarchy, restored centralized power, discipline in the army, and international prestige. His victory at Baghdad became one of the last great military triumphs of the empire. On the other hand, he was a ruler whose name is inextricably linked with unprecedented cruelty, mass executions, and terror. His night patrols and personal summary executions of transgressors became a symbol of absolute, all-consuming power that stopped at nothing to achieve its goals. His reign is a vivid example of how, in conditions of deep crisis, one man, obsessed with the idea of restoring order and greatness, can resort to the most extreme measures to save what seemed doomed. Murad IV was not an ideal ruler by humanitarian standards, but he was precisely what the Ottoman Empire needed during that dark period of its history. His actions, though horrifying, halted the disintegration, granting the empire another century of life. And his shadow, gliding through the night streets of Istanbul, sword at the ready, still remains in memory as a reminder of those times when power and cruelty were inextricably linked, and the salvation of an empire demanded a bloody sacrifice. He was a sultan who died, unbroken by either external or internal enemies, but leaving behind only the bitter aftertaste of fear and admiration.